Prometheusism was an ideology pioneered in the 1910s by Polish marshal and statesman Józef Pilsudski. Prometheusism, in short, was a strategy for promoting nationalist sentiment within the ethnic groups which comprised the western borders of the Russian Empire, with the ultimate end goal of sparking secessionist and independence movements, which would weaken Russia by bringing its western borders far closer to its capital, and by surrounding it with newly formed anti-Russian states. Like Prometheus giving fire onto mankind, Poland, having been the most powerful state to free itself from Russian imperial domination, felt a responsibility to bring the enlightenment of nationalism to those peoples which still found themselves under the Russian yoke. Prometheusism was, of course, a fairly revanchist ideal. That is, it was greatly driven by a desire for revenge against one of the three powers which eradicated Poland from the maps for over a century. Russia standing as the main target because at the time, it remained the sole state which could seriously threaten Polish security in the aftermath of the Great War. Austria having been shattered into a fragment of its former grandeur, and Germany having been seriously crippled in its economic, political, and military capabilities. There was also a very strategic purpose to this policy. With the exceptions of Finland, Poland, and Ukraine, none of the remaining non-Russian nations which resided within the borders of Russia were particularly powerful on their own, or even in unity with one another. It was because of this that Poland had always intended to bring these states under its own sphere of influence, either through an alliance or direct annexation via their intermarium plan, of which it and Ukraine would be the leading powers. Now before we go any further, let's take a moment to thank today's sponsor, MyHeritage. In case you haven't heard, MyHeritage is one of the leading services in the field of family history, making use of an extensive archive of historic records numbering in the billions, as well as a DNA testing service that provides you information on where your ancestors came from and allows you to discover members of your family tree both near and far, past and present. With MyHeritage, you can find new relatives and grow your family tree easily. Before arriving in America, my family had a long history in Italy. For as far back as we know, we've always lived there, but apparently we also have some English, Dutch, Belgian, French, and German branches on our family tree as well. So it's been interesting exploring records I could find and piecing together a family tree based on both what I found and what I already knew. Really, it's a pretty fun and enlightening experience, and that's not even mentioning the fact that you can colorize, enhance, animate, and really bring new life into old photographs through MyHeritage's Photo Enhancement tab. You might find yourself spending a couple hours on this alone, imagining what it might have been like to be in that picture with your great-great-grandparents back overseas or in the old family house. Don't just take my word for it. The link in the description of this video will take you to MyHeritage's website where you can try the service out for 2 whole weeks to really get a sense of it. And if you like what you see and want to keep learning more about your own history, you'll be able to continue your subscription at a 50% discount. So go ahead and give it a try. Now, back to the video. As time progressed, Prometheusism gained traction outside of Poland among other Russian rivals, and eventually became synonymous with a general strategy by any Russian rival to weaken Russia by these same means of promoting independence movements among its non-Russian constituents, albeit with varying desired geopolitical outcomes. For example, both National Socialist Germany and Imperial Japan took an interest in Promethean ideals for their own geopolitical gains in the 1930s and 40s, but of course the end of World War II would see a reversal of power upon these rivals, including Poland, being reduced of territory, weakened, and in Poland and East Germany's case, brought under Soviet-Russian domination. In the post-war period, only the United States remained to challenge the Soviet Union for the role of the global superpower, and thus it was during the Cold War that the US and its allies became the new bearers of the Promethean torch. The Soviets would, in kind, make their own efforts at chipping away at the Western powers under the guise of promoting decolonization and anti-imperialism, fully intending to spread its communistic ideology to newly liberated states and bring them under their own geopolitical sway. The communist bloc proved incredibly effective at spreading and promoting these subversive anti-Western thoughts across the West and its colonies, as the general openness of Western democracies left them extremely vulnerable to concentrated social pressures. Communism had spread across most of East Asia, gained limited support in the Middle East, and even gained a foothold in North America through Cuba, all the while Western influence had receded near entirely from the African continent. The closed-off and highly centralized nature of the Soviet Union allowed it to withstand similar pressures within its own borders initially, but ultimately the USSR faced an overwhelming weight of internal issues, which were brought to a crashing conclusion by the liberalization efforts of Mikhail Gorbachev. The USSR had collapsed, leaving Russia the smallest and most exposed it had been in centuries, and still conflicts like the Chechen War, not to mention the persisting independence movements across the Republic, left some speculating that Russia would fragment even further. But it didn't. Under Vladimir Putin, Russia took to centralizing its hold over what were previously relatively autonomous republics and entities, and has restarted Soviet and Tsarist-era Russification policies within the autonomous regions, with the sole exception of Chechnya, with whom Putin has forged a special relationship. In the modern day, Prometheusism is still alive and well by the very nature that Russia-Western relations have not been mended. The Western powers have a vested interest in neutralizing Russia as a political and military threat, as it is, with perhaps the sole exception of China, the most powerful state that currently stands outside of the Western-led global order, an order which Russia has grown increasingly hostile toward, though not entirely without reason. Whereas in the past, Poland would directly collaborate with independence movements and the American CIA would attempt to push subversion within the Soviet bloc, today such actions are largely carried out by Western-backed non-government organizations or NGOs, responsible for various color revolutions, such as the 2022 Steppe Revolution in Kazakhstan and the 2014 Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine. The purpose of these color revolutions being to drive through regime change within a number of Russian allied states or states with pro-Russian governments. With the outbreak of the 2022 Russia-Ukrainian conflict, Russia faced an unprecedented degree of ostracism and economic retaliation by the West, and calls for the weakening of Russia to prevent further aggressions as well as calls for regime change have grown ever louder. Given this historic and seemingly growing campaign to partition Russia, we must ask, is the breakup of Russia inevitable? Well, likely not. As we previously stated, Russia has taken significant measures to increase its control over its various non-Russian autonomous states. These states, with the exception of actually autonomous Chechnya, are in no position to mount a significant uprising and defensive campaign against the Russian government, nor would most of them have any real means of surviving outside the influence of Russia or another power for very long because of economic, logistical, and geographic constraints. Secession advocacy has also been outlawed, giving Russia's government the ability to nip any organized uprising in the bud before it has a chance to grow out of control, and even in such a circumstance, Russification has further hindered the influence of such movements within their own territories. NGOs, though not outright outlawed within Russia, are forced to disclose that they are foreign agents in any public works. Further, certain NGOs can be designated as dangerous or subversive by the Russian judiciary, essentially paralyzing their ability to do anything, and in extreme cases, such groups can be forced to disband. Putin and Russia as a whole have grown increasingly weary of NGOs given their impact over the last 2 decades, dramatically diminishing their effectiveness and giving Russia an additional layer of protection akin to, albeit not as extreme as that which the Soviets enjoyed on account of their closed-off nature during the Cold War. Russian allies are also demonstrating resistance to NGOs and color revolutions, as shown by the failures of the steppe and slipper revolutions in Kazakhstan and Belarus. Truly, the only outcome that could drive Russia to such collapse would be a disastrously critical defeat for Russia in the conflict with Ukraine and a failure on the part of Putin to keep Russia on the path toward growth and self-sufficiency in the aftermath, now that Russia will be cut off from major global institutions. Neither of those outcomes appear likely as of the writing of the script, but circumstances could certainly change. The implications of a Russian collapse would be dramatic and would radically shift the global power dynamic for over a century, not to mention create a number of wild factors which could spawn additional unforeseen consequences. For instance, the matter of Russia's nuclear arsenal being raided, sold off by Russia, a successor state, or individual officials, and what that would mean for global security. But that's a story for another video. Thank you all for watching, be sure to like the video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe for more. Mr. Z, out.